Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, consider carefully what it means to ask this question. What are the ancient gods that even Cthulhu fears? The phrasing itself implies an inverted hierarchy, a shadowed pinnacle behind the already unspeakable. For decades, Cthulhu has stood as a cultural symbol of cosmic terror, a sleeping giant beneath the waves, dreaming malignantly. And yet, within the pages of H.P. Lovecraft's most cryptic writings and the marginalia of his correspondence, there are suggestions, faint, fragmented, of powers far older, vaster, and more alien than even he. This is not mythology in the traditional sense. It is something closer to a literary fracturing of reality itself. In this long-form investigation, we will not simply catalog names or speculate about monstrous anatomies. Instead, we will proceed with scholarly discipline and anthropological caution. Through close textual analysis, historical contextualization, and cultural comparison, we will trace the lineage of these unknowable entities, those that inhabit the blurred periphery of the mythos, those hinted at only in madness-ridden texts, and those said to exist beyond time and comprehension. These are not characters, but ontological disruptions. To speak of gods that terrify even Cthulhu is to question the limits of knowledge, the stability of meaning, and the boundaries of fear itself. If such entities exist, they do not wait in space, they wait in thought, and by contemplating them, even now, we may already be participating in the very collapse they represent. The early 20th century was a crucible of philosophical disillusionment and scientific upheaval, and it is within this context that H.P. Lovecraft began to articulate a vision of horror unlike anything that had preceded it. While Gothic tales had long trafficked in curses, revenants, and ancestral madness, Lovecraft positioned his work at the juncture of post-Victorian despair and modern scientific dread. Born in 1890 and active primarily during the 1910s through the 1930s, Lovecraft was writing at a time when classical Newtonian mechanics was being shattered by the unsettling implications of quantum theory and relativity. At the same time, World War I had upended the notion of rational human progress, replacing it with an image of mechanized slaughter and geopolitical entropy. In such a world, it is perhaps no surprise that Lovecraft's fiction reflects a radical reordering of existential priorities, placing mankind not at the center of creation, but as a transient anomaly in a cosmos governed by forces both indifferent and unknowable. It is critical to understand that Lovecraft's myth-making was not haphazard or merely decorative. It was deliberate, systemic, and philosophically grounded. When he introduced Cthulhu in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, it was not to crown a singular monstrous entity, but to signal humanity's misplaced confidence in its own cognitive primacy. Lovecraft intended Cthulhu to be a kind of mediator, an intermediary terror, powerful enough to provoke awe, but still comprehensible enough to be given shape, name, and story. Beyond Cthulhu, however, Lovecraft began to hint at beings whose nature defied description altogether. Gods such as Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth were not described in anatomical terms, but through metaphors of chaos, infinity, and temporal collapse. These were not gods as characters. They were functions, principles, or voids in the metaphysical structure of reality. In doing so, Lovecraft constructed not a pantheon, but a conceptual trap, each deity adored to something more incomprehensible than the last. Consider carefully the literary architecture Lovecraft was erecting. Through seemingly isolated tales, he seeded a mythos that functioned more as an epistemological puzzle than a traditional mythology. He employed fictional texts, most notably the Necronomicon, as both world-building devices and philosophical statements. These books within books served to anchor the horror in a tradition of secret knowledge, inaccessible to most and dangerous to all. But more importantly, they reflected Lovecraft's view that the greatest terror lies not in what is imagined, but in what is only barely glimpsed. The ancient gods that even Cthulhu fears were often invoked indirectly, mentioned in passing, or gestured toward through dreams, madness, or cryptic rituals. This strategy was not a failure of description, but a calculated refusal to give form to the formless. By withholding clarity, Lovecraft invited the reader into the space of existential vertigo. It is not simply that Lovecraft avoided defining these greater entities, rather, he embedded their unknowability into the structure of his stories. In tales like The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, and The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, characters stumble upon fragments of cosmic truth that do not resolve into clarity, but instead unravel their capacity for reason. These moments function not just as plot devices, but as thematic enactments of what we might call epistemic horror, the terror that knowledge itself may be corrosive, destabilizing, or meaningless. Cthulhu, with his tentacles and cyclopean city, becomes the outer limit of narrative containment. Beyond him are entities whose very existence destabilizes language, narrative, and sanity itself. And it is these entities, the ones who dwell not in the sea, but in the margins of thought, that this documentary will pursue. We must recognize that Lovecraft's intent was not to create a simple taxonomy of monsters. He was constructing a literary mechanism for philosophical inquiry, albeit one cloaked in the trappings of horror fiction. His private letters, especially those to Clark Ashton Smith and August Derleth, reveal a preoccupation with what he called cosmic indifference. In a 1927 letter, Lovecraft wrote, "All my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. The gods that terrify even Cthulhu are, in this framework, not antagonists. They are reminders that meaning, morality, and coherence are anthropocentric illusions. And if these illusions falter, what remains is not just fear, but philosophical dissolution. The literary implications are equally profound. By inserting these unknowable gods into the scaffolding of his narratives, Lovecraft challenges the very premise of storytelling. Traditional narratives revolve around conflict, resolution, and transformation. But what if the protagonist is irrelevant? What if the conflict cannot be understood? What if the only transformation is madness? The presence of higher gods, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, disrupts not only the world within the story, but the reader's interpretive framework. These entities do not demand worship or obedience. They demand a re-evaluation of the categories by which we organize thought. It is not fear in the conventional sense they provoke, but a kind of ontological nausea, not terror, but vertigo. In this light, Cthulhu becomes an introduction, a necessary step in a longer descent. He is the icon, the face, the threshold. But like all thresholds, he exists to be passed through. Behind him are powers that do not sleep, because they do not dream. They do not move, because they exist beyond motion. They do not think, because thought implies separation. The question, what are the gods that even Cthulhu fears, is thus not a search for more monstrous forms. It is a question of scale, of structure, of significance. It is a descent into recursion, into paradox, into silence. And so, having established Lovecraft's historical moment and creative trajectory, we now turn to the deeper layers beneath that vision. What cultural and philosophical soil nourished these alien horrors? What ancient traditions prefigured them in distorted reflection? To answer these questions, we must move further back in time, into the pre-modern, the esoteric, the mythic. We begin, as so many horror tales do, with antecedents cloaked in shadow. To fully comprehend the deeper roots of the gods that even Cthulhu fears, we must turn our gaze backward, not just through literary history, but through cultural memory, mythic transmission, and philosophical speculation. Long before Lovecraft penned the first eldritch phrase or conceived of his cosmic entities, human civilizations had already been whispering about beings that predate the gods of Olympus or the patriarchs of monotheism. These weren't deities in the familiar sense, not protectors, creators, or even judges, but primordial forces whose existence challenged the very structure of reality. Cultures from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, from the pre-Socratic Greeks to Gnostic sects, preserved traces of entities that were more rupture than presence. We must recognize that Lovecraft was not inventing a void, but naming one that had always been there. Consider the Mesopotamian goddess Tiamat, first recorded in the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation myth dating back to the 12th century BCE. Tiamat is not simply a monstrous dragon or chaotic mother figure. She is chaos embodied, the watery abyss from which all things emerge. When the younger gods rise against her and fashion the world from her corpse, it is not triumph, but separation, order carved violently from chaos. This foundational myth parallels Lovecraft's own structuring of cosmic order as tenuous and artificial. Just as the Babylonians feared Tiamat's return, Lovecraft hints that the gods beyond might one day reassert themselves, dissolving the illusion of order. In this way, Tiamat becomes a prototype, not of a specific Lovecraftian entity, but of the function these gods perform within narrative and psyche, the revelation of a primal, underlying disorder. Equally significant are the philosophical systems that emerged in the ancient Mediterranean. The early Greek philosophers, particularly Anaximander, Heraclitus, and later Plotinus, grappled with the concept of a pairon, the boundless or indefinite, as the origin of all things. For Anaximander, writing in the 6th century BCE, the cosmos emerged not from a god, but from this formless, limitless principle. The apeiron was not divine in a moral sense, but rather an impersonal, unknowable generator. This notion, while abstract, bears a striking resemblance to Lovecraft's portrayal of entities like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth. These beings are not personalized deities, but ontological principles, chaotic, boundless, and fundamentally inaccessible. The alignment is not literal, of course, but thematic. Lovecraft channels the same unease, that at the root of existence lies not reason, but something formless and terrifying. We must also turn to esoteric traditions, especially those that circulated on the fringes of early religious thought. Gnosticism, emerging in the first centuries CE, proposed a radical reconfiguration of divinity. The God of the Bible was not the supreme being, but a lesser, ignorant entity, sometimes called Yaldabaoth, who had created the material world in error or arrogance. Beyond him existed a pleroma of true hidden gods, vast alien intelligences utterly beyond comprehension. In this inversion, we find a powerful precursor to Lovecraft's model. Cthulhu, though terrifying, is a dreamer within the prison of reality. The real powers, those that he fears, lie in a deeper, more secret realm. It is not simply a matter of strength, but of ontological hierarchy. The gods we know may themselves be deluded, their dreams haunted by older truths. Lovecraft, knowingly or not, was extending a lineage of radical Gnostic horror. Philosophically, Lovecraft was deeply influenced by the materialist and pessimistic thinkers of the 19th century, especially Arthur Schopenhauer and later Friedrich Nietzsche. Schopenhauer's vision of the will, an irrational blind force that drives all life, resonates with Lovecraft's depiction of cosmic entities that pulse with activity but lack coherent purpose. Azathoth, described as the blind idiot god, is a chilling manifestation of Schopenhauer's metaphysical will, stripped of aesthetic abstraction. Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, a universe endlessly cycling through the same events, finds its echo in Lovecraft's repeated theme of forgotten histories returning, of cycles beneath time. But it is not simply a philosophical echo. It is a distortion, a reflection in a warped mirror. Where Nietzsche sought liberation through the acceptance of recurrence, Lovecraft finds only despair. Knowledge is not empowering, but annihilating. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's mythos is not born of fantasy, but of the collision between ancient myth, radical theology, and modern philosophical despair. The gods that terrify even Cthulhu are not inventions so much as syntheses. They are composed of our oldest fears, that chaos is the true nature of reality, that knowledge is corruption, and that human perception is a thin membrane stretched over a vast, roiling darkness. This triadic structure, chaos, knowledge, perception, forms the backbone of Lovecraft's cosmic horror and reflects a broader cultural anxiety. In this light, the ancient gods function less as antagonists and more as metaphysical punctures, sites where the illusion of stability gives way to raw, terrifying indifference. Finally, we must consider the symbolic logic of apocalypse traditions, from the Hindu concept of cosmic cycles, yugas, and ultimate dissolution, pralaya, to the Norse Ragnarok, and even Christian revelation. Each posits an end not as simple destruction, but as a return, a reset to primordial chaos. Lovecraft adapts this idea, stripping it of moral or theological scaffolding. The return of these deeper gods is not a punishment nor a judgment. It is entropy made manifest. In this framework, Cthulhu is not a harbinger of the end, but a reminder of the beginning. He is a dream, yes, but the gods beyond him are wakefulness, a kind of awareness that annihilates all dreamers. It is not just history that they erase, but the capacity to understand what history ever meant. And so we arrive at the symbolic core of Lovecraft's forbidden pantheon. Rooted in ancient chaos myths, early metaphysical speculation, and apocalyptic visions of cyclical collapse, the gods that even Cthulhu fears are not aberrations. They are, in a sense, the only constants, forms that persist across time, across cultures, under different names. Having traced these cultural and philosophical antecedents, we now turn to language itself. How does Lovecraft signal these horrors through etymology, phonetic structure, and symbolic evasion? What does it mean to name the unnameable? The problem of naming in Lovecraft's fiction is never merely linguistic. To speak a name especially one not meant for human tongues, is to initiate a chain of epistemic consequences. Language, for Lovecraft, is both a mask and a wound, a veil that simultaneously obscures and reveals forbidden realities. Nowhere is this clearer than in the names of his so-called gods, particularly those that exist above or beyond the tier occupied by Cthulhu. Names like Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Shub-Niggurath resist both pronunciation and comprehension. They appear as incantatory fragments, dense with consonants, trailing with guttural syllables, and seething with alien cadence. We must recognize that these names are not labels in the conventional sense. They are symbolic disturbances, phonetic markers of a rupture between human cognition and something older, deeper, and utterly incompatible with understanding. Consider Azathoth. The name appears to contain familiar linguistic elements. Azaz, recalling the biblical Azazel, and Thoth, evoking the Egyptian god of writing and knowledge. But these echoes never resolve into clarity. Instead, they serve as false trails, linguistic illusions that hint at meaning while denying it. According to some of Lovecraft's letters, Azathoth was conceived as a parody of the Christian God, a blind, idiot creator at the center of all things, whose dreaming sustains reality. In this vision, language does not describe Azathoth. It fails around him. His name is not a revelation, but a collapse. What we encounter in Lovecraft's naming convention is the suggestion that to name something is to risk its becoming, but that these names, being only approximations, are always already inadequate. Thus, the more we attempt to articulate these entities, the further we drift from meaning. This brings us to the idea of phonetic horror, a concept largely unexplored outside of specialized literary analysis, but crucial to Lovecraft's project. Many of his invented names, Nyarlathotep, Zoth-Omog, Groth, operate on a sonic register. They combine harsh, gutturals, open vowels, and consonant clusters that echo a primordial non-Western cadence. This isn't random. Linguistically, these names operate on the fringes of known phonology, invoking the uncanny valley of sound. They are nearly pronounceable, almost relatable, but always just alien enough to unsettle. The unease comes not from overt grotesquerie, but from an eerie familiarity that collapses under scrutiny. This technique aligns with Lovecraft's broader aesthetic, the tension between comprehension and madness, between the recognizable and the forbidden. The names of these higher entities are phonetic paradoxes, oral traps designed to snare the human mind. But what of writing? Here we must pause to consider the deeper symbolic function of written language in Lovecraft's mythos. The Necronomicon, that infamous grimoire of unknowable truths, is not simply a collection of spells or invocations. It is a metatext, a representation of language's failure to contain the real. In story after story, exposure to its contents leads not to power, but to epistemological collapse. What is crucial is that these collapses are often triggered by names, words, or sigils that mark the presence of the ineffable. The Necronomicon does not explain Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth. It mentions them, and in doing so, it contaminates the reader with proximity to meaning without ever granting access to it. This reveals something profound. In Lovecraft's universe, language is not a bridge to knowledge, but a vector of infection. To read is to risk unraveling. We must also consider Lovecraft's use of symbolic evasion, his practice of substituting descriptions with gestures toward the indescribable. Phrases like, "a name I dare not speak," a sound not meant for ears, or an inscription no sane eye could endure, populate his texts. This is not mere literary coyness. It is a structural principle. By evading description, Lovecraft creates a negative space of horror, an absence that becomes more terrifying than presence. The gods that even Cthulhu fears are almost never described directly. Instead, they are gestured toward through linguistic failure. This aligns with mystical traditions in which the divine is approached only through apophasis, negative theology, the articulation of what God is not. In Lovecraft's case, the horror is not that the gods are unknowable. It is that they are almost known, and what little we grasp is ruinous. Comparisons to other literary traditions help clarify this. In Dante's Inferno, the ineffability of divine justice is rendered through architecture, number, and hierarchy. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan's rebellion is framed through persuasive rhetoric and linguistic grandeur. But in Lovecraft's mythos, the unspeakable is literal. The horror is embedded in the breakdown of semiotic coherence, the crumbling of language as a tool for ordering reality. If Milton's Satan could say, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," Lovecraft's Azathoth cannot speak at all, nor could he be spoken to. His very existence unmakes the premise of dialogue. In this way, Lovecraft's deities occupy a literary position not of villains, but of silencing voids, anti-characters who erase plot, agency, and voice. This leads us to a final implication, that Lovecraft's names do not point to identities, but to zones of ontological rupture. These are not gods in the sense of beings with will or personality. They are not even subjects. They are events, unfolding disturbances in the structure of being. To invoke them is to open the mind to a reality where causality, identity, and language disintegrate. In this sense, every Lovecraftian name is a symbolic black hole, a site where meaning collapses under the weight of its own proximity to the real. The horror is not in what they mean, but in the fact that they almost do. And so, we arrive at a paradox. The more we say their names, the less we understand them. But the less we speak of them, the closer we drift to their silent center. Having examined the linguistic and symbolic structures that signal the presence of these forbidden entities, we now turn to their narrative construction. How does Lovecraft lend these gods a sense of mythic authenticity? How are they embedded in a world that feels not invented, but discovered? Lovecraft's mythos endures not because it demands belief, but because it mimics belief's machinery. Unlike traditional fantasy authors who construct elaborate world-building scaffolds filled with pantheons, chronologies, and linguistically coherent lands, Lovecraft rarely offers cohesion. Instead, he employs fragmentation, contradiction, and textual layering to simulate the organic development of myth. The result is a body of stories that feels unearthed rather than invented, narratives not told but recovered. We must recognize that this illusion of discovery is no accident. It is the product of deliberate literary strategy. In creating gods that even Cthulhu fears, Lovecraft was not populating a fantasy world, but cultivating a sense of archaeological dread, one built from half-legible inscriptions and scattered textual fossils. A central technique in this strategy is the use of pseudo-scholarship. The Necronomicon, Hanakodic manuscripts, Book of Ibon, and other arcane volumes serve not merely as fictional devices, but as markers of historiographic layering. These books are cited, misquoted, banned, and translated. They appear in footnotes, marginalia, and as vague references in character dialogue. Crucially, their contents are never fully revealed. They exist in a liminal zone, present enough to signal authenticity, but incomplete enough to maintain mystery. This mirrors how real-world ancient texts function in cultural memory: partial, contested, potent. By constructing this ecosystem of forged sources, Lovecraft transforms the reader from passive consumer to investigator, a role that, paradoxically, brings them closer to epistemic ruin. Equally important is Lovecraft's technique of mythic intertextuality. His stories speak to each other across time and geography, yet without the coherence of a unified canon. For example, The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, references the madness from the sea, an invented text, and the Dunwich Horror, 1929, invokes both the Necronomicon and rites from New England folklore. Characters, events, and deities cross into other narratives, but never cleanly. Instead, each retelling contradicts or distorts what came before, as if filtered through the corrupted lens of unreliable narrators, degraded manuscripts, or oral legends. This strategy mimics the way myth functions in oral cultures, not through fixed documentation, but through retellings that evolve, fray, and merge over generations. It is not consistency, but textual erosion that makes Lovecraft's world feel ancient. Consider carefully the absence of definitive cosmology in Lovecraft's work. There is no single account of the hierarchy between Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Shub-Niggurath. Their relationships are implied through symbolism, hinted at in dreams, or described by characters already descending into madness. This is a key feature of myth building. The gods beyond Cthulhu are not just powerful, they are structurally elusive. To know them completely would require a mental architecture incompatible with human perception. This is where Lovecraft departs sharply from earlier mythographers like Homer or Hesiod. His goal is not to explain the divine, but to suggest its inaccessibility. In doing so, he builds a mythos where incompleteness is not a flaw, but a signal of authenticity. Moreover, Lovecraft masterfully blurs the line between fictional myth and real cultural memory. He locates his horrors in recognizable geographies, Arkham, Innsmouth, Kingsport, but fills them with invented histories, fabricated Native American lore, and distorted anthropological claims. This creates a false ethnography that feels uncomfortably plausible. By borrowing the tone and structure of academic writing, scientific reports, expedition journals, linguistic studies, Lovecraft cloaks his myths in the robes of scholarship. It is not simply that the mythos is believable, it is that it borrows the authority of belief. When a narrator quotes the Necronomicon and pairs it with references to actual Sumerian deities or obscure geological formations, the reader is lured into a space where fiction and history are no longer easily distinguishable. This reveals something profound about the nature of narrative authenticity in horror fiction. Lovecraft does not ask us to believe in his gods. Instead, he invites us to believe that someone else once believed, and that their belief left a trace in the world. This strategy mirrors how real-world occult traditions often function. Grimoires, talismans, and rituals are not compelling because we believe in their efficacy, but because we believe they once held power for someone. The mythos gods operate in the same way. Their presence is not in manifestation, but in residue. They are felt in corrupted texts, in dreams misremembered, in chants whose last syllables are always just out of reach. And it is this absence, this echo without a source, that makes them so compelling. Finally, we must examine Lovecraft's refusal to ever center these entities. Even the stories in which gods appear do not revolve around them directly. Azathoth never speaks. Yog-Sothoth manifests only through distorted phenomena. Nyarlathotep, perhaps the most present of them all, never reveals his full scope. Cthulhu dreams, yes, but never awakens fully. The gods that terrify even him remain in deeper shadows. This structural displacement aligns with apophatic theology, where the divine can only be understood through what it is not. In Lovecraft's hands, this becomes not a path to spiritual transcendence, but to ontological vertigo. The farther one looks into the mythos, the less clear the contours become. What emerges is a myth that collapses meaning rather than reinforcing it. And so, having explored the mechanisms through which Lovecraft constructed a mythos that feels older than history, through pseudo-scholarship, intertextual decay, false ethnography, and structural displacement, we are prepared to descend further. It is now time to examine not only how these gods are framed, but what they are said to be. In the next section, we will turn to the core philosophical themes at the heart of Lovecraft's cosmos: insignificance, entropy, and the unstable nature of reality itself. At the heart of Lovecraft's mythos lies a philosophical structure as pitiless as it is profound, one that undermines not just the individual ego, but the very scaffolding of meaning itself. His fiction is not merely populated by grotesque entities or forgotten tomes. It is undergirded by a worldview in which the universe is cold, chaotic, and utterly indifferent. The gods that even Cthulhu fears embody three interlocking concepts that define Lovecraft's brand of cosmic horror: insignificance, entropy, and the instability of reality itself. These are not narrative themes in the traditional sense, but philosophical positions that transform horror into metaphysical inquiry. To begin with, insignificance is the cornerstone. Unlike Gothic horror, which often emphasizes moral failing or ancestral guilt, Lovecraft's terror emerges from cosmic scale. Humanity is not central to the mythos. It is not even marginal. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, the narrator famously reflects, "We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity." This is not a metaphor. It is a metaphysical declaration. The ancient gods beyond Cthulhu are not watching, judging, or interfering. They are unaware. And if they become aware, it will not be to punish or reward, but to annihilate through mere presence. The terror is not personal, it is ontological. What does it mean to be irrelevant in the very structure of being? This question haunts every tale. Insignificance leads inexorably to entropy, the recognition that all order, meaning, and structure are temporary illusions subject to inevitable decay. Many of Lovecraft's higher entities are not creators, but dissolvers. Azathoth, described as a blind idiot god who pipes mindlessly at the center of the universe, is not a sovereign, but a vortex. His dream sustains reality, but only as accident, not intention. If he awakens, the dream ceases, and with it, all existence. This is entropy rendered as divinity. Likewise, Yog-Sothoth, the all-in-one and one-in-all of limitless being and self, collapses time, causality, and progression into a singular, inescapable state. To encounter him is not to gain knowledge, but to witness the simultaneous unraveling of all linearity. Time becomes meaningless, Events blur, and identity dissolves. The universe does not die in fire or ice. It slouches into irrelevance. We must pause here to consider the psychological toll of such a worldview. Lovecraft's characters rarely die heroically. They descend into madness, into abstraction, into erasure. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1936, Nathaniel Wingate Peasley's consciousness is displaced by a race known as the Great Race of Yeth, whose vast archive exists outside conventional time. When he returns, he is haunted not by violence, but by the incomprehensibility of what he experienced. He remembers not pain, but structureless knowledge. It is not evil that afflicts him. It is epistemic exposure. Similarly, in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the horror lies not in the alien Mi-Go themselves, but in what they imply about the porousness of reality and the futility of resistance. Lovecraft's fiction teaches that to glimpse the truth is to realize how little one can know and how little it matters. From this springs the third and perhaps most radical concept, dream reality, or the instability of perception itself. If insignificance removes humanity from cosmic centrality and entropy assures the collapse of all structures, then dream reality questions whether those structures were ever real at all. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-27, Randolph Carter travels through the dreamlands in search of a forbidden city, only to learn that the city is a projection of his own nostalgic desire. But this revelation is not redemptive. It is destabilizing. Carter is returned to waking life, not with insight, but with loss. The gods of the dreamlands, particularly Nyarlathotep, use dreams as weapons. They collapse the boundary between perception and delusion, forcing characters to confront not what is real, but that reality itself may be a mistake. It is not simply that dreams are dangerous. It is that waking may be worse. This is the paradox Lovecraft constructs again and again. The Silver Key, 1929, suggests that Carter's life is more meaningful in dreams than in consensus reality. The Thing on the Doorstep, 1937, implies that consciousness is transferable, that identity is porous, and that one's self may not be one's own. In these tales, reality is not a refuge. It is a construct built on convenience, awaiting collapse. The gods that even Cthulhu fears are not bound by dreams. They are the architects of false awakenings, entities whose existence reveals that perception is the final prison. If Cthulhu dreams, then these gods are the ones who dreamed the dreamer, and what follows is a recursive abyss. This triadic core, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, forms the architecture of Lovecraftian horror, but its ultimate power lies in its lack of resolution. These are not puzzles to be solved, but conditions to be endured. No hero masters these forces, no priest banishes them, no scientist contains them. The horror is not in defeat, but in irrelevance, in the realization that all systems, language, science, theology, narrative, are sandcastles before the tide. The gods that lie behind Cthulhu are not more powerful in a mythological sense. They are more fundamental, more metaphysically destabilizing. They are what remains when belief, knowledge, and perception have all dissolved. And so we emerge from the philosophical bedrock with only one certainty. The deeper one looks, the less one sees. As we now turn to these entities themselves, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep, we will attempt not to define them, but to explore how they function within this matrix of horror. They are not gods of fear. They are gods of unmaking. To examine the beings that exist beyond Cthulhu is to abandon the comfort of traditional mythological systems. These entities are not defined by narrative arcs, moral functions, or coherent cosmologies. They are not simply more powerful. They are categorically different, operating at a level that destabilizes our understanding of identity, purpose, and even temporality. What follows is not a taxonomy, but a study in conceptual rupture. Lovecraft's higher entities, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep, do not rule a pantheon. They dismantle the logic of pantheons, existing not as figures within a myth, but as principles that unmake the structures myths rely upon. They are not gods that terrify Cthulhu because they threaten him directly, but because they render him and all things fundamentally meaningless. Foremost among these is Azathoth, the blind idiot god, described by Lovecraft in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-27, and referenced in whispers throughout his corpus. Azathoth lies at the center of all existence, mindless and writhing, accompanied by the thin, monotonous piping of demonic flutes. But this is not a hellish scene in the moral sense. It is cosmic absurdity given form. Azathoth is not malevolent, nor is he asleep like Cthulhu. He is awake in the most terrifying sense, awake without mind, purpose, or awareness. He dreams reality by accident, and should he ever stop, everything would vanish with him. Consider carefully. This is not divinity as we know it. It is the horrifying possibility that everything is contingent upon the chaos of an unconscious center. Where traditional gods offer origin stories, Azathoth offers erasure erasure. Next is Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, described in the Dunwich Horror, 1929, as coterminous with all time and space. Yog-Sothoth is not in the universe. He is the universe, in all its dimensions and layers, existing at once in every possible point of time. But this is not omniscience in the benevolent theological sense. It is total presence without boundaries, a consciousness so complete that it cannot interact, only overwhelm. In the Dunwich Horror, Yog-Sothoth fathers monstrous children with a human woman, one of whom is invisible and growing rapidly, warping time and space around him. The result is not just physical horror, but temporal collapse. Villagers forget events, time loops back on itself, and language frays at the edges. To invoke Yog-Sothoth is to risk dimensional breakdown, the flattening of past, present, and future into a single, incomprehensible event. This is not knowledge as power, it is knowledge as obliteration. Where Azathoth is chaos and Yog-Sothoth is totality, Shub-Niggurath represents the perversion of life itself, often referred to as the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young. Shub-Niggurath embodies uncontrolled proliferation, a kind of biological entropy. She is rarely depicted directly, but her presence is felt in fertility rituals, grotesque birth imagery, and unnatural growth. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the idea of unnatural birth is mirrored in the alien Mygo's harvesting of human brains and ambiguous reproductive processes. Shub-Niggurath is not life as we understand it. She is fecundity unbound, the horror of infinite, uncontrolled creation. If Azathoth is chaos and Yog-Sothoth is collapse, Shub-Niggurath is corruption, the defilement of form through endless variation. She reveals that life itself is not sacred, but mechanical and diseased, a mistake that multiplies itself. We must pause here to acknowledge Nyarlathotep, the outlier among these forces. Unlike the others, he speaks, interacts, and even delights in manipulation. Described in Lovecraft's prose poem, Nyarlathotep, 1920, he is the crawling chaos, a shapeshifter who walks the earth, spreading madness. Unlike Azathoth, who dreams without intention, or Yog-Sothoth, who encompasses without awareness, Nyarlathotep is performative. He is the mask of the outer gods, the messenger of deeper horrors, and the only one who chooses to mimic humanity. But this mimicry is not benevolence. It is a strategy of epistemic warfare. Nyarlathotep toys with sanity, eroding the barrier between rationality and madness. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he mocks Randolph Carter, luring him with the illusion of wish fulfillment before revealing cosmic indifference beneath it. Nyarlathotep does not destroy. He lets the victim destroy themselves by knowing too much. This reveals something profound about the role of these entities. They are not evil in the way traditional antagonists are. Their horror is not derived from malice, but from incommensurability. They exist on levels that do not intersect cleanly with our ontology. Azathoth cannot be reasoned with because he lacks reason. Yog-Sothoth cannot be avoided because he is already here, always. Shub-Niggurath does not choose to spread life. She is life, uncontrolled. Nyarlathotep alone wears the mask of intentionality, but his actions lead only to confusion and loss. Together, they form a pantheon not of purpose, but of principles. They are gods not of creation, but of unmaking, each one a symbol of a different failure, of meaning, of time, of biology, of self. And yet, despite or because of their inscrutability, these beings exert immense gravitational pull on the human imagination. Scholars, cultists, madmen, and seekers throughout Lovecraft's corpus are drawn to them, not because they offer hope, but because they break the world cleanly. To understand them, even a little, is to escape the false comfort of human exceptionalism. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, Walter Gilman's exposure to non-Euclidean geometry leads him into realms where Nyarlathotep waits, not with threats, but with persuasive invitations. It is not a bargain. It is a test. How much reality are you willing to abandon? And so we find ourselves surrounded by entities whose very existence dismantles coherence. These are the gods that Cthulhu fears, not because they command him, but because they dissolve the framework that gives him meaning. Cthulhu is a god within myth. Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep are what myth collapses into when it reaches its limit. Now we must ask, what happens to those who come into contact with these beings? How does the human mind respond to truths that the psyche cannot hold? The human response to Lovecraft's cosmic entities is not heroism, but collapse. Where traditional mythologies portray contact with divinity as revelation or transformation, Lovecraft's universe offers only annihilation of the self. His characters do not gain enlightenment. They disintegrate under the pressure of truths too large for the human mind. Madness, in this context, functions not as punishment, but as adaptation, a final desperate compromise between perception and oblivion. The moment of contact, whether through forbidden texts, alien dreams, or direct manifestation, is never survivable in the cognitive sense. One may live, but one does not return unchanged. The most merciful thing in the world, Lovecraft writes in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. To correlate them, to glimpse the whole, is to shatter. Consider the case of Francis Wayland Thurston, the narrator of The Call of Cthulhu. His descent begins not with terror, but with scholarship. He collects testimonies, police reports, and cult fragments, reconstructing what he believes is an intellectual puzzle. Yet with each discovery, the tone of his writing grows increasingly fractured, his reason trembling beneath the weight of connection. When he finally understands that Cthulhu's rising is not isolated myth, but a symptom of cosmic recurrence, his reaction is not fear of the creature itself, but dread of comprehension. Knowledge becomes infection. The process mirrors what we might call epistemic entropy. Information does not illuminate, it corrodes. Madness, then, becomes a kind of psychological firewall, a system failure that prevents the mind from fully integrating its own annihilation. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, Lovecraft transforms madness into biological revelation. The narrator's discovery that he shares ancestry with the amphibious deep ones blurs the line between human and inhuman, sanity and acceptance. His final words, "I shall swim out to that seashore and join my cousins," are not the utterance of a man broken by insanity, but one who has adapted to a larger truth. In this moment, madness becomes transcendence, or rather, the only form of survival possible in a meaningless cosmos. The human mind, unable to preserve its boundaries, merges with the inhuman and calls it peace. We must recognize the inversion here. Insanity does not mark failure of understanding, but the completion of it. In stories such as The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, and The Dreams in the Witch House, 1933, madness also serves as communication, a way for entities to infiltrate consciousness. Henry Akeley's correspondence with the alien Migo begins as rational inquiry and ends as possession. Walter Gilman's mathematical exploration of non-Euclidean space dissolves into occult revelation. These are not men encountering external monsters, but minds being rewritten by new geometries of thought. Madness here is not chaos, it is translation, the mind's futile attempt to render non-human logic into human language. What results is fragmentation, disordered speech, irrational behavior, and visionary nightmares that serve as the residue of contact. Lovecraft's stories suggest that human cognition is a fragile linguistic architecture. When it meets cosmic grammar, it cracks. We must pause here to consider the function of dreams as mediators between sanity and revelation. Dreams are Lovecraft's chosen bridge between consciousness and the incomprehensible, the safe threshold that is never truly safe. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter's journeys through the dreamlands reflect an oscillation between control and dissolution. The dream world begins as escapism, but ends as metaphysical entrapment. The dream is not a retreat from the real. It is the real, temporarily coded in symbolic form. The gods that even Cthulhu fears often appear first in dreams, whispering not threats, but recognitions. They tell the dreamer what was always true, that consciousness itself is the dream of something vaster. To awaken is not triumph, but terror. Philosophically, this structure mirrors modern psychological theories of cognitive dissonance and existential trauma, but Lovecraft anticipated these through literature. The human mind, when faced with information that negates its core assumptions, must either deny it or disintegrate. Madness in Lovecraft's world is not random. It is a structural inevitability, a mechanism of self-preservation through partial blindness. Those who go mad do not lose reality. They see too much of it. In this sense, Insanity functions like dark adaptation in the eye, an adjustment to unbearable light. As one scholar observed, Lovecraft's protagonists are martyrs of understanding, consumed by the fire of knowledge that was never meant to be kindled. This reveals something profound about the ethics of perception. In Lovecraft's mythos, ignorance is not limitation, but mercy. Civilization itself is constructed on the suppression of certain truths, the illusion of centrality, of stability, of meaning. To confront the beings beyond Cthulhu is to witness the undoing of all these illusions simultaneously. Madness is not the failure of mind, but the price of honesty. The gods are not malicious, they simply exist, and in doing so, they expose reality's scaffolding as a fragile lie. When contact occurs, the mind must choose collapse or illusion. Neither is victory, but one at least allows continued function. And so we see that human interaction with Lovecraft's higher powers always ends in the same paradox. To survive is to forget, and to remember is to dissolve. Madness, therefore, is the only possible form of reconciliation, a way to continue existing in a world that no longer makes sense. Having traced the psychological and philosophical dimensions of human contact with these entities, we must now ask, what drives the pursuit of such forbidden truths in the first place? Why do Lovecraft's seekers continue their descent, even knowing the cost? To encounter forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's fiction is not to gain power, but to undergo disintegration. The mythos does not reward curiosity. It punishes inquiry with ontological collapse. In traditional stories, the pursuit of hidden truths results in revelation or transformation. In Lovecraft's cosmos, knowledge itself is corrosive, an acid that eats through the foundations of meaning. Characters do not simply go mad because what they learn is horrifying. They go mad because what they learn renders all previous knowledge invalid. This is epistemic collapse, not the failure to know, but the recognition that knowledge no longer functions. To learn the names of Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth is not to unlock secrets, but to suffer a permanent, irreversible distortion of reality. This is made painfully clear in The Dunwich Horror, 1929, where the scholar Armitage confronts the spawn of Yog-Sothoth and must turn to arcane rites to contain it. But the true horror lies not in the incantation or the monster. It lies in the implications of the texts he reads. The Necronomicon, long dismissed by academia as superstition, is revealed to contain real but unusable knowledge. Its truths are incompatible with rational frameworks. Armitage survives, but at what cost? His world remains intact, yet his understanding of it is permanently fractured. We must recognize that Lovecraft is not critiquing ignorance. He is suggesting that truth itself is a vector of madness. There is no redemption through knowledge, only unraveling. This structure is echoed in The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, where Ackley's exposure to alien communication and extra-dimensional truth begins with letters and ends with silence. His final communication, sent in a tone of unnerving calm, suggests either assimilation or annihilation. The knowledge he gains from the MyGo, who claim to preserve human brains for interstellar travel, is not horrifying because it is false, but because it might be true. The epistemic horror lies in the collapse of categories: mind versus body, man versus machine, soul versus material. Ackley's voice is still human, but what it says is no longer trustworthy. The collapse is not external, it is semantic. Language continues to function even as meaning evaporates. Forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's world often arrives through textual mediums, books, inscriptions, letters, symbols. But these are not merely plot devices, they are agents of collapse. The act of reading is never neutral. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, 1941, the protagonist's descent begins with historical documents and culminates in his identity's erasure. The past, when unearthed, refuses to stay past. Knowledge acts as contagion, infecting the present with structures of thought that do not belong there. The Necronomicon is particularly emblematic. It is not a book of spells, but a monument to epistemic rot. It reveals not just information, but the limits of interpretation itself. The more one understands, the less one remains oneself. It is not ignorance that protects, but the inability to interpret. Consider carefully the idea that the human mind is not merely vulnerable, but unfit. Lovecraft repeatedly implies that cognition evolved not for truth, but for survival within narrow parameters. What the mythos reveals is not merely hidden facts, but the irrelevance of the mind as an interpretive tool. In From Beyond, 1934, the activation of a machine that enhances perception does not show invisible entities. It shows that they have always been there, unnoticed, only because the human nervous system is limited. The horror is not the entities themselves, but the fact that reality was never what it seemed. The collapse is not triggered by invasion, but by realization. Madness is not the presence of something new. It is the loss of the ability to ignore what has always been true. This reveals something profound. In Lovecraft's fiction, the pursuit of truth is indistinguishable from self-destruction. The more coherent one's understanding becomes, the more unbearable reality appears. There is no reconciliation, no integration, no synthesis. Instead, there is only fallout, a progressive unraveling of all frameworks through which meaning is constructed. The forbidden knowledge is not dangerous because it is secret, but because it is true in a way that truth should not be. It destabilizes not only perception, but metaphysical infrastructure, time, causality, identity, logic. Once glimpsed, it cannot be unlearned. It becomes a parasite of cognition. This dynamic stands in stark contrast to the mythic tradition of Promethean knowledge, fire stolen from the gods for human benefit. Lovecraft offers no such fire, only darkness mistaken for light. His gods do not guard secrets. They are the secrets, and their revelation is synonymous with collapse. In this context, the seeker is not heroic, but tragic, a figure whose noble impulse toward understanding is met not with punishment, but with metaphysical indifference. The collapse is not imposed by the gods. It is a natural consequence of overstepping the limits of the human mind. The forbidden is not locked away. It is simply outside our capacity to comprehend without destruction. And so we arrive at the heart of the Lovecraftian paradox. The desire to know is irresistible, but the result of knowing is unlivable. The epistemic collapse that follows contact with higher truths is not an anomaly. It is the only possible outcome. Madness, silence, or surrender, these are the only available responses. The beings that exist beyond Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep did not erupt fully formed from Lovecraft's imagination in a single work. Rather, they emerged gradually, dispersed across stories, letters, and prose poems, coalescing through implication rather than declaration. Their presence is felt not in grand appearances, but in whispers, fragments, and references that resist neat categorization. In many ways, Lovecraft's most powerful entities originate not as mythic figures, but as narrative absences, points of dread around which meaning collapses. The earliest appearances of these beings thus serve not to introduce characters, but to puncture the reader's sense of a stable literary world, establishing a mythos built on unstable foundations and recursive unease. The entity we now call Nyarlathotep first appeared in Lovecraft's 1920 prose poem of the same name. It is a curiously non-narrative piece, more prophetic than plot-driven, and it establishes Nyarlathotep as a wandering figure, a tall, swart man who brings strange devices from Egypt and performs demonstrations that leave his audiences disturbed and deranged. And I remember that the people went about with pale faces, the narrator recounts, and whispered warnings to one another. The story lacks conflict, climax, or resolution. Its function is to seed psychic contagion. Nyarlathotep is not a monster, but a force of psychological destabilization. His emergence here marks the first rupture in Lovecraft's fictional universe, one where madness spreads not through violence, but through contact with distorted knowledge, a theme that will recur throughout the mythos. A similarly early mention of Azathoth comes not in a fully fleshed out tale, but in the closing lines of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-27. There, Lovecraft briefly names the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space, which the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred dreamed of as Azathoth. This single line contains multiple conceptual detonations. First, the phrase nuclear chaos is not a reference to atomic energy. This was written prior to Hiroshima, but a metaphor for elemental instability. Second, the idea of a chaos beyond angled space suggests non-Euclidean geometry and dimensional distortion. Azathoth is not encountered directly. He is invoked as the logical endpoint of cosmic descent. This technique, placing the entity at the limits of narrative, imbues Azathoth with more horror than a description could ever accomplish. He is an idea glimpsed from the periphery, a concept that destabilizes the story's world simply by being named. Yog-Sothoth first takes central narrative form in The Dunwich Horror, Note 29, a story notable for its unusual structure and tone. While many of Lovecraft's works embrace ambiguity, The Dunwich Horror reads almost as an exorcism tale, complete with scholars, ritual, and a climactic confrontation. But the horror lies not in spectacle, but in ancestry. Yog-Sothoth fathers monstrous twin children with a human woman, and one of them, the invisible Wilbur Whately, grows to an impossible size, consuming livestock and destabilizing the landscape. Yog-Sothoth is the key and the gate, we are told. Yog-Sothoth is the gate to where the spheres meet. This is a being who does not dwell within time and space, but encompasses it entirely. His function in the story is dual. He both enables the plot as father of the monstrous offspring and renders it meaningless, for the true horror is that such a being would interact with humans at all. The resulting narrative tension between the mythic and the mundane reflects Lovecraft's broader strategy of making the cosmic uncomfortably proximate. While Shub-Niggurath is rarely encountered directly, she is invoked repeatedly across Lovecraft's stories, often in the form of cultic chants and profane rituals. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the protagonist uncovers evidence of worship practices connected to the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, suggesting a grotesque fecundity beyond comprehension. Though the story's central antagonists are the Mygo, it is the hints of larger forces, forces the Mygo themselves may worship or fear, that give the tale its deeper resonance. Unlike the more narratively embedded Yog-Sothoth or Cthulhu, Shub-Niggurath operates through implication. She is referenced, not shown, called upon, not answered. This strategy mirrors ancient fertility cults, where the gods of abundance and decay are one and the same. Shub-Niggurath embodies biological horror, the nightmare of life that multiplies beyond containment. What binds these appearances together is intertextual reverberation. Lovecraft rarely explains, he accumulates. A phrase in one story becomes a central dogma in another. A god named in passing reappears as a primary force several tales later. This is not inconsistency. It is mythic logic where stories overlap, contradict, and build towards something unspeakable. The references to the Necronomicon in multiple stories serve to unify this structure. Each quotation is slightly different, each translation suspect, each usage more dangerous than the last. Through these recursive fragments, Lovecraft constructs not a coherent mythology, but a network of cognitive instability. The result is a mythos that behaves like memory, patchy, unreliable, and full of haunting echoes. This reveals something profound about the evolution of Lovecraft's gods. They do not develop like characters, nor are they refined through retellings. They intensify through accumulation, gaining power not from presence, but from repetition without explanation. The earliest appearances establish them not as actors within the story, but as structural disturbances, forces that collapse narrative, undermine ontology, and erode perception. As we move forward into deeper case studies, we will see how this mythic groundwork supports longer, more elaborate narratives, stories where the presence of these gods is no longer just whispered, but begins to shape the very reality the characters inhabit. Among Lovecraft's major narratives, The Dunwich Horror, 1929, stands as a pivotal moment in the evolution of his mythos, particularly in its direct engagement with Yog-Sothoth, one of the most abstract and destabilizing of the cosmic entities. Unlike many other stories where the presence of the Old Ones is only implied or referenced obliquely, the Dunwich Horror dares to place their influence at the center of the narrative, constructing a tale of rural decay, blasphemous birth, and unseen terror. What is crucial, however, is that even here, Yog-Sothoth does not appear in person. He is evoked through incantation, genealogy, and rupture. The result is a story that remains grounded in human investigation while steadily fracturing the boundary between the human and the inhuman. The story is set in the fictional Massachusetts village of Dunwich, a place already saturated with degeneration and whispered superstition. From the opening, Lovecraft presents a world that is not merely backward, but contaminated, a site of thinning barriers between dimensions. The Whately family, particularly the albino Lavinia and her monstrous son Wilbur, becomes the conduit through which this contamination intensifies. Wilbur grows at an unnatural rate, speaks in tongues, and seeks access to the forbidden Necronomicon. But the true horror, it is revealed, is his invisible twin brother, an immense, unseen force that stalks the countryside, tearing through trees and farmhouses, unseen yet undeniably present. This narrative technique, the gradual revelation of an invisible horror, mirrors the larger function of Yog-Sothoth in the mythos, always near, always surrounding, but never fully containable in language or sight. Lovecraft provides the most concentrated articulation of Yog-Sothoth's nature through the incantations and monologues of both Wilbur and later, the scholars attempting to understand the crisis. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate, we are told. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. These lines encapsulate the epistemic horror that defines the deity, not simply that Yog-Sothoth exists, but that he exists outside the confines of time, space, and causality. To interact with such a being is to dissolve the linear narrative of human life. Past and future cease to have meaning. Events lose sequence. In mythological terms, Yog-Sothoth does not inhabit the cosmos. He is the cosmos in its totality, folded in on itself. The horror here is ontological. The world is not as it seems, and its true structure is unlivable for human minds. The climactic confrontation in the story, where Dr. Armitage and his fellow scholars perform an arcane rite atop the hills of Dunwich, seems at first to resolve the tension. The invisible horror is banished, the town spared, and the incantation appears to have worked. But this resolution is deceptive. The final words of the story, spoken by the dying entity, Wilbur's twin, reveal a far deeper trauma. Father, Father, Yog-Sothoth, I would have seen what lies beyond. I would have joined the ones beyond the stars. This is not the ravings of a beast, but a failed transcendence, a moment of longing for union with something far beyond the human. The tragedy is not the monster's destruction, but its incompletion. It sought to breach the veil, to return to a realm where identity, form, and chronology no longer mattered, and was denied. This final utterance reframes the story's events, not as a victory of reason over madness, but as a temporary containment of a cosmic process already underway. We must recognize that the Dunwich horror is not merely a tale of a creature defeated. It is a ritualistic reenactment of the core Lovecraftian tension, the thin membrane separating humanity from the truth of its insignificance. Through Wilbur's unnatural origin, the story literalizes the theme of forbidden hybridity, the human mixed with the utterly inhuman. Through the Necronomicon and the recurring invocations, it emphasizes that language itself is unstable, that the very words used to protect reality may in fact summon its undoing. And through Yog-Sothoth, it reveals that the true terror is not what waits beyond the gate, but that we are already within it, merely unaware. The story's placement within the larger mythos also deserves attention. Though Azathoth and Shub-Niggurath are not named here, their absence is suggestive. The Dunwich horror occupies a transitional space in Lovecraft's corpus, moving from local, folklore-based horror into a systematized cosmology of universal forces. Yog-Sothoth, with his entanglement in time and identity, becomes a kind of narrative lever, a tool through which the story lifts from superstition into cosmic implication. Dunwich is not simply cursed, it is interfacing with another plane. The events of the story are not isolated but symptomatic. They hint at a universe where such breaches are increasingly common, where the end of human primacy is not dramatic but gradual, occurring in forgotten hills and decaying barns. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's approach. Even when he gives us a plot, even when monsters are named and actions are taken, the final effect is not clarity, but deepening uncertainty. The Dunwich horror does not explain Yog-Sothoth. It only brings us closer to his gravitational pull. Through family, ritual, and sacrifice, the story plays out the tension between containment and collapse. It gives form to the formless, only to show that the form cannot hold. And in doing so, it becomes a central text in the mythos, not because it defines, but because it destabilizes. If the Dunwich Horror demonstrates the cosmic rupture caused by forbidden birth and incantation, the dream quest of unknown Kadath, written 1926-27, takes the reader far deeper, beyond the world of waking, into a realm where reality is shaped by dream, and yet remains no less terrifying for it. This sprawling novella, perhaps Lovecraft's most ambitious narrative experiment, functions not merely as a fantasy tale, but as an ontological labyrinth. Its protagonist, Randolph Carter, traverses the dreamlands in search of a mysterious sunset city he has glimpsed in dreams. Yet what begins as an epic of yearning becomes a cautionary parable about desire, perception, and metaphysical entrapment. The further Carter journeys, the clearer it becomes that the forces governing the dreamlands, particularly Nyarlathotep, are not there to reward the seeker, but to distort the very meaning of seeking. The structure of Kadath mirrors mythic quests like those in Homer or Dante, but with one crucial difference. No divine guidance exists. Carter does not journey toward knowledge or enlightenment, but instead toward a deeper entanglement with forces that resist comprehension. Along the way, he encounters ghouls, moon beasts, night gaunts, and priestly beings whose rituals conceal the influence of the great old ones. Yet none of these are the story's true antagonist. That role belongs, increasingly and unmistakably, to Nyarlathotep. As the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep exists not in one form, but many, masking himself, manipulating others, and always eroding the boundary between Carter's dream self and some greater cosmic structure. He is the voice behind the veil, promising revelation, but offering only psychic dismantling. Nyarlathotep's ultimate function in the story is to expose the futility of Carter's quest. After a vast journey, Carter learns that the city he longs for, the city of marble and sunset, is his own idealized childhood home, seen through the lens of nostalgia. The marvels of unattainable sunset, Lovecraft writes, were only the marvels of a memory. This final revelation is not triumph, but recoil. Carter's desire to possess the city becomes, in Nyarlathotep's hands, a trap, a gesture toward the dangerous notion that dreams can be domesticated, known, controlled. The city is beautiful because it is lost. To pursue it is to risk obliterating its meaning, and in framing this loss as a cosmic plaything for a god beyond understanding, Lovecraft suggests that memory, identity, and longing are themselves points of existential weakness. We must recognize the philosophical depth of this structure. Carter does not encounter the gods directly, but rather glimpses their effects: dimensional anomalies, crumbling architectures, hybrid species, and the behavioral residue of civilizations that once tried to commune with higher powers. Even the gods of Earth, who Carter hopes might aid his quest, are found cowering in Kadath, having fled the approach of greater entities from outside. Their names are not given, but their attributes imply the presence of beings like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth. These deities do not communicate with Carter, nor do they offer punishment or reward. Their arrival is felt as ontological destabilization. The rules of space and identity dissolve. Out of the dark, Lovecraft writes, a voice that was not a voice spoke. This paradox, communication that dismantles comprehension, is central to the logic of the story and to the function of Lovecraft's higher gods. The narrative ends with Carter awakening from his dream, returned to the waking world, seemingly unchanged. But the reader understands something deeper has occurred. His journey through the dreamlands has revealed not a hidden truth, but a closed loop, a structure of infinite regress, where desire leads only to disillusionment. The dream, far from being a sanctuary, is a trap woven by the gods to ensnare those who would trespass on cosmic hierarchies. Unlike the neat closures of traditional quests, Kadath offers no treasure, no closure, no spiritual elevation. Instead, it reiterates a central Lovecraftian theme. The act of seeking itself is dangerous. To want to know is to enter a game whose rules are written by entities for whom meaning is irrelevant. Importantly, Kadath integrates the mythos more structurally than diegetically. That is, rather than explaining Nyarlathotep or mapping the cosmology of Azathoth, it demonstrates how these entities function narratively as agents of recursion, erasure, and deferred meaning. Where Cthulhu threatens awakening and Yog-Sothoth threatens collapse, Nyarlathotep ensures false awakening, the illusion of return to safety. Carter awakens, yes, but only after being shown that what he sought was always unreachable and perhaps always false. The dreamlands, like the mythos itself, do not exist to be mastered. They exist to be endured. This reveals something profound. The dream quest of unknown Kadath is not merely an adventure in a surreal world, but a parody of human striving. Every step Carter takes deepens his distance from meaning, even as he believes he is approaching it. Nyarlathotep, who waits at the end of every corridor, is not an antagonist in the traditional sense, but a function, the collapse of certainty, the disintegration of resolution, the cruel echo of the answer just beyond reach. The story ends where it began, but its psychological residue lingers. Carter is back in the waking world, but the reader is not. We have seen what lies beneath the surface of dreams, and what we've glimpsed does not want to be named. When H.P. Lovecraft died in 1937, the universe he had conjured, fragmented, suggestive, and vibrationally unstable, did not end with him. Instead, it was expanded, appropriated, and in some cases restructured by his literary colleagues, admirers, and later generations of writers. This was not mere homage. It was a collective act of myth-making, one that sought to render the unspeakable speakable, the ambiguous definable. Chief among these collaborators was August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and self-appointed mythographer, whose influence would transform the amorphous horror of the original mythos into something closer to a theological framework. Derleth did not merely continue Lovecraft's work, he reinterpreted it, applying metaphysical categories that Lovecraft himself had studiously avoided. In doing so, he inadvertently revealed the profound difficulty of maintaining ambiguity in shared mythologies. Derleth's most enduring and most controversial contribution was the division of Lovecraft's cosmic entities into elemental forces of good and evil. In Derleth's system, beings like Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth were reclassified as elder gods, forces of malevolence associated with fire, water, air, and earth. Counterbalancing them were the Elder Ones, or benevolent deities, such as Nodens and Hypnos, who supposedly worked to protect humanity. This moral bifurcation was deeply antithetical to Lovecraft's vision, which was rooted not in cosmic conflict, but in cosmic indifference. Lovecraft's gods do not battle for souls or seek dominion. They simply are immense and unconcerned. By recasting these entities into a quasi-Christian structure of good versus evil, Derleth offered comforting categories where Lovecraft had only offered existential collapse. We must recognize that this shift was not merely interpretive, but structural. Derleth's stories, such as The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, and The Trail of Cthulhu, 1944, move toward resolution, offering protagonists who uncover, resist, and sometimes defeat cosmic threats. Rituals work, sigils protect, and divine allies can be summoned. The unknowable becomes knowable, the chaotic, containable. These narratives provide narrative closure, a feature almost entirely absent from Lovecraft's originals. The horror remains, but it is recontextualized within a cosmic theology, where human will matters and fate can be resisted. This is not an evolution of Lovecraft's mythos, it is a domestication of it. Despite these philosophical divergences, Derleth's efforts played a crucial role in preserving and disseminating Lovecraft's legacy. Through the founding of Arkham House, he ensured that Lovecraft's works, many of which had only appeared in pulp magazines, would be preserved in hardcover editions. Without Derleth, much of Lovecraft's corpus might have remained ephemera. Moreover, by encouraging other writers to expand the mythos, Derleth helped catalyze the emergence of a shared literary universe, one of the earliest and most complex in genre fiction. But this collaboration came at a cost. As more writers contributed, the mythos became increasingly systematized, reducing its original destabilizing power. Later authors, however, resisted this domestication and returned to Lovecraft's emphasis on unknowability and metaphysical vertigo. Writers such as Ramsey Campbell, Thomas Ligotti, and Caitlin R. Kiernan infused their contributions with a deeper philosophical unease, focusing less on monstrous beings and more on the existential rupture they symbolized. Campbell's settings in the Severn Valley, for instance, evoke a psychic decay reminiscent of Lovecraft's New England, yet filtered through modern paranoia and fractured memory. Ligotti takes the next step, removing the monstrous almost entirely and replacing it with ontological horror, a sense that not only is the world unreal, but that the self is a fragile performance. Kiernan, in turn, brings a lush fatalism to the mythos, emphasizing trauma, memory, and the futility of seeking coherence. These writers do not expand the mythos by explaining it. They expand it by withdrawing further into silence. The mythos also evolved beyond literature. With the advent of tabletop role-playing games, particularly Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu, 1981, the mythos entered the realm of interactive narrative, where players could investigate, survive, or succumb to cosmic mysteries. Here, the unknowable became gamified, with stats, health points, and sanity meters. On one hand, this broadened the mythos's cultural reach. On the other, it risked flattening its implications, turning philosophical vertigo into strategic play. Yet even here, glimpses of Lovecraft's original horror persisted, encounters that guaranteed not victory, but loss of self, and knowledge that always exacted a cost. This reveals something profound. The more people write about the mythos, the more it fractures. Each interpretation, whether Derleth's moral architecture, Kiernan's poetic dread, or Chaosium's structured gameplay, adds another layer, another mask. And beneath the masks, the original question remains unanswered. What are these gods, really? Not what do they represent, or what stories they inhabit, but what they are. The answer, if it exists, lies not in expansion, but in retreat. The mythos survives not because it has been explained, but because it has resisted explanation, continuing to mutate, adapt, and slip through categories. And so, as we close this literary exploration of the mythos' evolution, we must confront a new dimension, the myth's afterlife, outside of literature. In urban legends, film, music, and digital media, the gods beyond Cthulhu have taken on lives of their own, blurred, fragmented, and reassembled into new cultural shapes. But what happens when these beings escape the page and enter belief, mimicry, and modern folklore? Long after their fictional births, the ancient gods of Lovecraft's mythos have escaped their textual origins and seeped into the cultural ether, not merely as characters in horror stories, but as entities with rumored presences in the real world. This phenomenon, where invented myth bleeds into supposed folklore, is no accident. Lovecraft's genius was not in creating monstrous creatures, but in crafting a style of suggestion so convincing, so meticulously framed within pseudo-scholarship, obscure references, and believable textual history, that the line between fiction and hoax became porous. In the decades since his death, sightings, urban legends, and internet-age fabrications have elevated Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep from literary constructs to the subjects of modern mythic speculation, echoing the same mechanisms that birth and sustain ancient deities. Perhaps the most persistent of these cultural echoes is the Necronomicon hoax, which began not long after Lovecraft's death and continues to this day. Despite being an entirely fictional grimoire created by Lovecraft and attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, multiple print editions have appeared since the 1970s, purporting to be translations of the ancient text. Bookstores have stocked them under occult nonfiction, and even serious inquiries have been made by readers unaware of, or willfully ignoring, the text's literary origins. Some versions go so far as to fabricate histories, footnotes, and bibliographies, simulating the academic texture of Lovecraft's stories. This reveals something profound. When a text wants to be real, when it wears the costume of legitimacy, readers will fill in the gaps. The Necronomicon has become a living book, passed between believers, skeptics, and collectors, each projecting into it their own blend of irony and seriousness. These phenomena are not restricted to books. Reports of dreams, sightings, and rituals attributed to Nyarlathotep have circulated online in paranormal forums since at least the 1990s. Often framed as real encounters, these narratives frequently involve dream paralysis, visions of black-skinned, shifting entities, or auditory hallucinations resembling piping flutes or static-laced voices. While skeptics dismiss these as sleep paralysis episodes or deliberate fan fiction, their recurrence across time and geography suggests a different pattern: the emergence of a folk entity shaped by a collective vocabulary of dread. Like older legends of the devil, the Mothman, or the Black-Eyed Children, Nyarlathotep becomes a repository of cultural anxiety, mutating with each retelling. His status as the most human of Lovecraft's gods makes him especially potent in this regard. He walks among us, mimics us, and thus becomes indistinguishable from the hoaxer, the trickster, or the deluded. In rural America, particularly in parts of New England and the Pacific Northwest, stories persist of strange symbols carved into rock faces, remote cabins filled with ritual paraphernalia, or cults worshipping the ones beneath. While most of these accounts trace back to creepypasta, local legends, or ARG, alternate reality game, narratives, they'll often cite invented tomes like the narcotic manuscripts or whisper of Yog-Sothoth in the hills. These motifs are not merely Lovecraftian, they are hyper-Lovecraftian, produced by generations who internalized the tropes and began to simulate their own place within the mythos. The result is a recursive folklore, where hoax feeds story, story feeds belief, and belief generates fresh hoax. In this landscape, truth ceases to matter. What matters is participation, the act of spreading, doubting, or performing the myth that becomes the myth itself. The internet has amplified this process exponentially. Forums such as Reddit's Archie No Sleep, 4chan's Action X, and various YouTube horror ARG channels have transformed Lovecraft's ancient gods into relics of a digital occult. Some stories present themselves as found footage, lost documents, or diary entries. Others simulate field research, complete with grainy photographs, voice recordings, and fake academic citations. In one notable case, from 2016, an anonymous Tumblr account posted daily dream fragments for 6 months, claiming they were received from the one outside the axis of time, a clear reference to Yog-Sothoth. These dreams, filled with fractured syntax and surreal imagery, gained a cult following and remain archived as evidence. The point here is not that anyone truly believed, but that the performance of belief, the seriousness of the tone, blurred the boundary between roleplay and revelation. As with all living myth, sincerity and irony commingle until they are indistinguishable. We must pause here to acknowledge the psychological utility of these fabrications. In a world saturated with information yet starving for coherence, the mythos offers a narrative of sublime meaninglessness, a framework in which fear, uncertainty, and dislocation are not errors, but fundamental truths. Unlike conspiracy theories that seek to impose hidden order, Lovecraftian legends provide comfort in disorder. To believe that Azathoth dreams the universe is not to explain it. It is to relinquish the burden of explanation. This is why the mythos persists outside fiction. It offers a spiritual structure for the non-spiritual age, one where belief is play, and play is a form of belief. It is not that people believe in Azathoth, but that they believe in the idea of people who might. And so, the ancient gods that even Cthulhu fears now live not only in texts, but in networks of cultural behavior, hoaxes, dreams, sightings, and digital rituals. They exist as participatory myth, as postmodern folklore, as shared hallucination. Their power is no longer confined to the horror story. They are, instead, gods of circulation, thriving not in temples, but in hyperlinks, hashtags, and fragmented narratives that blur origin and intention. As we move to examine how these beings have shaped film, games, and music, we must carry with us a final, unsettling thought. Perhaps a myth need not be believed to be real. It need only be repeated. The ancient gods that even Cthulhu fears have not remained confined to the printed page or whispered legend. They have metastasized into the cultural bloodstream through cinema, interactive media, and sound. These adaptations rarely invoke Lovecraft's highest entities by name, but their influence is unmistakable. In fact, direct naming often dilutes the effect. Instead, filmmakers, game designers, and musicians borrow the aesthetic architecture of these beings: shapelessness, incomprehensibility, madness, and build upon them to evoke a sense of dread that words cannot fully convey. The result is a modern media landscape shaped not by representations of Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, but by their philosophical residue, experiences of narrative collapse, perception distortion, and existential erasure. In film, few works directly portray Lovecraft's pantheon of hypercosmic deities, yet their structural fingerprints are everywhere. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, while not explicitly Lovecraftian, presents a creature whose biology defies understanding, shifting shapes, absorbing identities, and annihilating the possibility of certainty. Similarly, The Void, 2016, depicts a hospital under siege by cultists and entities from another realm, invoking imagery and themes that echo Shub-Niggurath's monstrous fecundity and Azathothian chaos. But perhaps the most vivid cinematic analog is Event Horizon, 1997, where a spaceship becomes a portal to a dimension of pure suffering, a place beyond time and space, as the film describes it. There, the horror lies not in the entities themselves, but in the unmaking of reality, the annihilation of causality, and the sense that what lies beyond is both eternal and intimately aware of us. Video games, with their interactive and immersive nature, have proven especially fertile ground for exploring Lovecraftian themes, particularly those of madness, unreliable perception, and non-Euclidean architecture. The Bloodborne series, 2015, developed by From Software, presents a decaying city gripped by plague and occult ritual, but gradually unveils its true scope. The world is shaped by ancient great ones, whose presence causes reality to warp and unravel. As players encounter these beings, their insight stat increases, heightening their awareness, but also making the game world more horrific, complete with new enemies and distorted environments. This mechanic brilliantly literalizes the central Lovecraftian theme: to perceive more is to suffer more. The final stages involve contact with entities clearly inspired by Yog-Sothoth and Shub-Niggurath, whose influence is not malevolent, but indifferent and destabilizing. Other titles, such as Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, Amnesia, The Dark Descent, 2010, and The Shore, 2021, incorporate direct mythos references or adaptations. These games often use sanity meters, fragmented journals, and dream logic to erode the player's grip on narrative stability. The gods behind these mechanics are rarely seen. Their power lies in shaping the rules of the world rather than appearing within it. In Darkest Dungeon, 2016, the final boss is the Heart of Darkness, an entity buried beneath the earth, older than time, whose presence corrupts mind and matter alike. One must defeat it not through force, but by sacrificing one's own perception of coherence. These games do not ask the player to win, they ask them to endure the unendurable. In music, the influence of Lovecraft's highest entities emerges through soundscapes, dissonance, and anti-musical forms. Dark ambient artists such as Lustmord, Atrium Carceri, and Raison d'Etre produce compositions that avoid melody in favor of droning frequencies, distorted voices, and ritualistic textures. These are not songs, but atmospheres, sonic zones designed to erode the listener's temporal orientation. One track from Lustmord's Heresy, 1990, features deep tectonic rumblings layered with whispering in an unidentifiable language, an audio manifestation of Nyarlathotep's many voices. Black metal artists, including Portal, The Great Old Ones, and Yog-Sothoth, have gone further, incorporating direct references to mythos deities while embracing sonic chaos, complex time signatures, a tonal riffing, and lyrics that read like rituals. These compositions do not seek catharsis, they enact collapse. What unites these adaptations is not fidelity to Lovecraft's prose, but an allegiance to his philosophical atmosphere. Whether through film's visual abstraction, games' cognitive destabilization, or music's textural dread, modern media seeks not to represent the gods beyond Cthulhu, but to summon the emotional and perceptual state their presence would produce. This is why the highest entities, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, remain elusive even in adaptation. To name them directly is to diminish them. They are not antagonists to be defeated, but conditions to be simulated. Entropy, recursion, ontological nausea. This persistence suggests something deeper, that modern audiences, steeped in technological wonder and epistemic fatigue, resonate with narratives where truth is toxic and perception is fragile. The adaptations of Lovecraftian horror across media are not acts of nostalgia. They are attempts to re-encounter the unknowable in forms suited to new sensory regimes. A film can show the breach. A game can make you walk through it. A sound can make you feel like you've already fallen in. These experiences are not about monsters. They are about being unmoored from the assumptions that make life intelligible. And so, the gods that terrify even Cthulhu now live not just in stories, but in media architectures of collapse, films that never resolve, games that deny victory, and music that dissolves tonality. Their names may change, their forms may shift, but their function endures, to remind us that comprehension is a comfort we were never promised. As we turn now to subcultural and academic appropriations of these ideas, we must ask, when horror becomes theory, art, or lifestyle, does it lose its power, or does it become something more dangerous, a framework for living in a world we cannot control? If horror is, at its core, a cultural response to the limits of knowledge and the fear of dissolution, then it is no surprise that Lovecraft's mythos, particularly its higher entities, has found fertile ground not only in popular entertainment, but in academic discourse, underground subcultures, and philosophical speculation. What began as pulp fiction has been reinterpreted through lenses as varied as postmodern literary theory, internet age occultism, black metal aesthetics, and speculative realism. In each case, the gods beyond Cthulhu, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep, are not merely characters or metaphors. They become frameworks, adopted as tools for thought, resistance, or self-erasure. Their absorption into academic and subcultural systems reveals something profound. When horror is fully metabolized, it becomes a way of reading the world. In academia, particularly within the disciplines of philosophy, comparative literature, and religious studies, Lovecraft's work has become an unexpected touchstone. Scholars such as Eugene Thacker, author of In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, have drawn direct connections between Lovecraftian cosmology and negative theology, traditions that emphasize what cannot be known about the divine. Thacker refers to Lovecraft's horror as a world without us, a philosophical rupture in which human meaning-making breaks down in the face of indifferent totality. Similarly, theorists of object-oriented ontology, OOO, such as Graham Harman, have cited Lovecraft to illustrate how objects like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth possess withdrawn realities, inaccessible and irreducible to human understanding. These readings do not treat the mythos as fiction, but as a diagnosis of epistemic limits in the age of anthropocentric collapse. Subcultures, too, have appropriated the mythos, not as a joke or tribute, but as ideological alignment. In certain branches of the occult revival, especially online chaos magic communities, references to the black goat, the nameless mist, or the key and the gate appear alongside sigils, rituals, and DIY grimoires. While few claim literal belief, the symbolic potency of these names persists. Shub-Niggurath, for instance, is invoked not as a fertility deity in the traditional sense, but as a force of rampant multiplicity, a principle of breakdown through excess. Here, the mythos functions as a post-myth, a set of symbols that simulate sacredness while acknowledging its constructed nature. This ironic distance becomes a strength, allowing practitioners to explore belief as performance and rupture simultaneously. In the world of extreme music, particularly black metal, doom, and ritual ambient genres, the influence of Lovecraft's higher gods becomes even more visceral. Bands such as Portal, The Great Old Ones, and Sulphur Aeon build not only lyrics, but entire sonic philosophies around the mythos. Shub-Niggurath's name appears in album titles, Yog-Sothoth is referenced in liner notes, and Nyarlathotep is reimagined as a sonic virus. This is not nostalgia for pulp horror. It is an aesthetic weaponization of cosmic nihilism. The sonic dissonance, intentionally illegible typography, and obscured vocals serve as auditory analogues to the mythos's philosophical core. Meaning is inaccessible, and language is insufficient. These musical appropriations are not attempting to explain the gods. They are attempting to sound like them. Online communities, particularly those orbiting around forums like Reddit, 4chan, and niche Discord servers, have created para-subcultural spaces where Lovecraft's gods function as shared lexicons. In these zones, references to Yog-Sothoth are made not as lore citations, but as mimetic gestures, shorthand for that which cannot be known, but cannot be ignored. It is not uncommon to see users say, "Praise Azathoth," after posting something absurd, meaningless, or existentially void. This is not mockery, it is cultural coding. These gods have become signifiers of affect, ways to express disorientation, paranoia, or depressive insight. In a digital world that often feels dreamlike, recursive, and hostile to meaning, the mythos has become a coping language for those who feel permanently displaced. We must pause here to ask, what happens when horror becomes not just entertainment, but identity? For some, the mythos becomes a shield, ironic, intellectual, detached. For others, it becomes a mirror, reflecting a reality in which the self is unstable, truth is recursive, and gods exist only as placeholders for chaos. Academic appropriation gives the mythos weight, subcultural appropriation gives it movement. Together, they preserve and transform it, keeping it alive not through clarity, but through ever-deepening complexity. Unlike religious myths that ossify into doctrine, the mythos thrives on reinterpretation. It remains protean, like its gods, always shifting, always withdrawing just as we come closer. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft's higher entities are not timeless in the sense of divine permanence. They are timeless in the sense of conceptual utility. They survive because they represent not fixed beliefs, but strategies for enduring a world that refuses coherence. When Azathoth appears in a philosophy paper, or Shub-Niggurath in a black metal LP, or Nyarlathotep in a meme, they are not degraded. They are activated. Their function is not to dominate, but to remind. And what they remind us of is simple, chilling, and unshakable. Nothing makes sense, and that too has a structure. As we enter the final phase of this inquiry, we must now step back and examine what these appropriations and their enduring appeal tell us about the human condition. Why do these gods endure? Why do we summon them again and again in classrooms, in basements, in chat rooms, and in our dreams? The answers, if they exist, may not comfort, but they may clarify what it means to live in a universe that never promised we would understand it. To ask why the ancient gods beyond Cthulhu persist in our collective imagination is to confront the deeper terrain beneath genre, fandom, or even myth. These entities, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, Nyarlathotep, have come to embody more than just fictional horrors. They function as metaphysical placeholders, symbols for those aspects of existence that defy containment: chaos, totality, infinite recursion, self-erasure. Their continued cultural traction speaks not only to their literary power, but to a psychological need, an urge to grapple with the vertigo of scale, the crisis of meaning, and the limits of consciousness itself. These are not simply monsters. They are negative archetypes, invoked not to understand, but to ununderstand, to unmake the frameworks we use to survive. At a psychological level, Lovecraft's gods represent the dread that arises when the mind confronts its own boundaries. Unlike demons or ghosts, figures that imply continuity between the living and the dead, Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth suggest that consciousness is irrelevant in the broader scheme of things. They induce not terror of harm, but terror of nullity. To exist in their shadow is to realize that thought itself may be a local glitch, a temporary lens through which a meaningless universe briefly sees itself. This notion aligns uncomfortably with contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science, which increasingly suggest that the self is a constructed narrative, the product of modular brain functions, rather than any essential I. Yog-Sothoth, as the totality of space-time, is terrifying not because he can destroy us, but because he makes our concepts of self and now obsolete. Philosophically, these gods mirror several currents in postmodern and post-structural thought: the decentered subject of Derrida and Foucault, the non-anthropocentric realism of Quentin Meillassoux, and the dark vitalism of Eugene Thacker all point toward a similar conclusion: that the world does not revolve around human meaning-making, and may in fact be structured by forces fundamentally indifferent to it. In this context, Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of the universe, becomes more than a creature. He becomes an image of the real in Lacanian terms, that which cannot be symbolized, cannot be integrated, and whose intrusion into the symbolic order causes breakdown. To contemplate Azathoth is to touch the edge of an unsymbolizable abyss, a reminder that language and reason are local systems, not universal truths. We must recognize that this form of horror is not nihilistic in the simple adolescent sense. It is existentially rigorous. It does not say that nothing matters. It says that the structures by which we make things matter are fragile, contingent, and susceptible to collapse. In this view, madness, the inevitable response to contact with higher entities, is not a pathology, but a form of conceptual honesty. Madness becomes the psyche's way of reconciling irreconcilable data, of surviving the trauma of seeing beyond the veil. In Lovecraft's universe, sanity is not health, it is strategic blindness. Those who remain sane do so not because they are strong, but because they have not seen enough. This inversion subverts not only the horror genre, but our entire philosophical inheritance, from Plato to Kant, which assumes that reason is our highest tool. In the mythos, reason is the final delusion. The emotional texture of this realization is subtle. It is not terror in the traditional sense. There is no chase, no scream, no wound. It is a slow, expanding unease, a sublime disorientation. Lovecraft's gods do not arrive. They are already here. They do not pursue us. We are already entangled in them. This reflects what philosopher Timothy Morton calls the hyper-object, entities so vast in time and scale that they cannot be perceived in totality. Climate change, the internet, deep time, these are real-world counterparts to the mythos. They are not gods in the traditional sense, but they behave like them. They reshape our world while remaining incomprehensible as wholes. The ancient gods beyond Cthulhu offer a mythic frame for these modern anxieties, allowing us to narrativize that which exceeds narration. And yet, for all their horror, these entities also offer a strange form of liberation. To accept that one is not central, that one's mind is not the measure of all things, is to begin thinking outside the human. This is not self-hatred. It is intellectual humility at a cosmic scale. The mythos proposes a shift, not from knowledge to ignorance, but from knowledge to non-knowledge, to an awareness of how much will always remain inaccessible. In this, the gods function almost as philosophical koans. They cannot be solved, only meditated upon. Their meaning lies in their refusal to yield meaning, their power in their persistence as unresolved conceptual weights. They are not answers. They are questions that unmake the questioner. And so we return to the beginning. What are the ancient gods that even Cthulhu fears? They are not tyrants or adversaries. They are the edges of thought, the limits of structure, the silent conditions under which existence plays out. They persist, not because we believe in them, but because we need a language for the experience of collapse. In the silence, after every failed explanation, in the static, at the edge of every profound realization, in the vertigo of recognizing that understanding may be impossible, we find them waiting, and they are always waiting.